Hello, everybody. Introducing the last panel of the day. My name, as I said before, is Jacinda Kara. For those of you who possibly weren't around this morning, I'm with AFP, Agence France Presse, as one of their editors in the Europe team for fact-checking. We fact-check in more than 26 languages, I believe, exactly. And yeah, very, very honored to be hosting this panel on rethinking media literacy and fact-checking. So at AFP, as I said, we're very much at one end of that spectrum. There are some things that we do which hopefully do feed into media literacy, but a lot of the time we're confronted with perhaps the results of a certain lack of media literacy. So in a way, it will be interesting for me to hear a bit more about the other end of things. So just to run through our very distinguished panel, I'm joined by Sally Reynolds, who is the Chief Operating Officer at the Media and Learning Association, and also Director of Media Literacy for EDMO, and before that also has a background as a broadcaster and producer at RTE, the Irish public broadcaster, so lots of very relevant experience to bring to the table. Then we also have Jochen Spangenberg, who's the Deputy Head of Research and Cooperation Projects at Deutsche Welle. The focus of his work over the past decade has been on research dealing with social news gathering, disinformation analysis, and verification of digital content, and how that all ties back into our sector. So again, lots of very germane experience. Then Philipp Terlik, I hope I'm saying that correctly, the co-founder of Verify.ai, really fascinating project, which I hope we're going to hear a lot more about, which tries to use AI, if I understand correctly, in order to assess the trustworthiness of Czech news articles. All while pursuing a computer science degree at University College London and doing a million other things, so very impressive. Next to him is Petr Gongala, who's the project coordinator at our fact-checking colleagues, Demagog, who publish in Polish and then also via partners in the Czech Republic and Slovakia also, and also serves on the executive and strategy boards of SEDMO. And then last but by no means least, my colleague from AFP, Joyce Savlit, who at the moment is in charge of several projects in Europe focused on fact-checking and disinformation, but also before that has more than 3 decades of experience as a professional journalist, including stints as the bureau chief in Los Angeles, in Beirut, the head of the English desk for AFP for Europe and Africa. I could go on, but so again, lots of experience to bring to bear on this. And I thought we could start by having each of you just give a brief introduction to your thoughts on aspects of what we're going to be talking about. And if I could start with you, Jochen, to give your thoughts on what the kind of most relevant recent developments have been in media literacy, and also perhaps touch a little bit on your work with the organization Lie Detectors, who go into schools, as I understand, to talk to school pupils about media literacy. So yeah, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you also to you all that you are still all here. Yes, I've just taken some notes and some thoughts, and I've turned the 2 main topics around, and I want to start very briefly with fact-checking. And when I thought about this, I thought, well, fact-checking has been around really for a very long time. I mean, I work for an organization that has been doing sort of fact-checking since 1953, namely a news and public service media organization, and there's others that have been around for almost 100 years, like the BBC being founded in 22 or 27. So it has been around for a long time. Then we have the fact-checking organization that has surfaced only in recent years, of fact-checking initiatives and what have you. Many of them organized under EDMO, or we've heard it before, the EDMO hubs, SEDMO being one of them. So all this, I would say, taken together, is something very valuable and important. It's great to have this, and it certainly, in these times, have added lots of benefits. Full stop. However, I think we also have to be self-critical. And by that I mean, are we really reaching the people we are aiming to reach? Are we reaching the right people? Are we preaching only to the initiated? And how do we do it? What's the impact of what we are doing? We've talked about polarization before. What can we do about it? How can we counter that? How can we cooperate? I know there's a lot of cooperation, which I really think is very, very good and so important, of the different hubs cooperating. So not to duplicate the wheel, but just to really cooperate and pool resources. So this is all very important, just some sort of food for thought for later. Now, taking all this to the next level, in an ideal world, I think we would have media systems that are pluralistic, that are fact-based, that are trusted, hunky-dory land, whatever. We also would have politicians or public people, human beings, that would at least aim to speak the truth and not deliberately deceive or lie. That's the ideal world. However, again, another however, we do not have such an ideal world. But, and that's my point, and sometimes I'm pessimistic, but I hope generally I'm trying to keep my optimism. We should strive really for the better or the best, to make this a better world. And that, to me, above all, while I've talked about fact-checking, but above all, really it requires critical thinking among the community, society. And what is society? That also includes young people, the next generation, our children and grandchildren. I don't have any yet, any grandchildren, only children. But that's what really is required, making them critical thinker, because it's not only Europe's future. I think the future of the world relies on the next generations. So making them critical thinkers, teaching them to think critical, to assess information, to see through whatever is presented to them. And there's various ways and initiatives, and Justina, you mentioned it. I, for example, have been involved for the past 5 years with an organization called Lie Detectors that goes into schools and tries to do that. On the one hand, teach young people aged 10 to 15-year-olds what they can do to counter disinformation, or to assess information on the one hand, but also to teach them what journalism is, how journalism functions. And journalists make mistakes. But this is the core message I try to get across when I go into schools. There's a big difference between a journalist making mistakes. That happens. I think all of us have made mistakes. It's the worst thing that can happen to you. But if you do, you can correct it and you can be open and transparent about it. But this is something different to deliberately deceiving and telling lies. And this is also something I try to bring across to these young people so they understand the nuances as well. And with that, I want to leave it just handing over also to Sally, because Sally is just doing exactly that, work in the field of media literacy, which I think is such an important field and area where we have to invest, I think, much more probably than we do now. Over to you, Sally.
Thank you.
Sorry. No. I don't want to leave you out.
Doing my job for me. That's absolutely, that's very welcome.
Is it okay if I go on?
Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the introduction and for being here. It's really nice to be at this conference and to be here in Prague with all of you. We were just saying this earlier. The interest, of course, in media literacy has been around for a very long time. There's a lot of research in this area. A lot of people have been very busy around the topic of media literacy. But of course, we're seeing an explosion at the moment in terms of interest, and a necessary explosion, very vital. But I think there are a couple of things that are worth saying when we start to look at media literacy as a topic. First of all, there's a bit of a tendency, I think, more and more to argue that, well, teaching kids fact-checking, is enough. just being able to know where their sources are coming from and to be able to check back on images. Of course, it's not. Media literacy is much more than that. It's about a whole set of skills, competences, attitudes, the ability to critically analyze the media world in which you not only are passive, but are also an active member of. So we consider it a much broader topic than simply, of course, fact-checking. We would argue there's a nice Dutch expression which you may know, which is dwelen met the kraan open, which is trying to mop up with the tap still open. We think a lot of fact-checking sometimes feels a little bit like that. It's a bit too late at that stage. So what, of course, we're looking for, and people who are active in the area of media literacy, is something far more fundamental. It's not just in schools, but right the way across different levels of society. Getting there is a huge challenge, and I think sometimes we're pulled out of the hat like a rabbit and sort of said, okay, media literacy is going to solve all the problems that we have, which of course isn't true. We're looking at something that is, I sometimes ask people to replace the word media with the word food in literacy. My friend Paolo Salot talks about this in IAVI, and he says, well, what makes people food literate? It means that they develop from a very early age an understanding of what good nutrition is. They understand, they start to learn to look at the back of the packet, for example, what's actually going into the food. We have legislation which controls the manufacture and the sale of food. We also, when you look at, for example, the idea of good quality food is sometimes more expensive and out of the reach of people who've got limited resources. So just sometimes think in those terms. And then you realize that media literacy is not something that we're going to tackle with a single set of, adaptations in schools or a single set of nice workshops. I love the idea of journalists going into schools. I think it's a great exercise and it can really, engage students very much directly. But doesn't replace a whole generation of teachers who need to be trained, a whole generation of teachers who with their classes going forward in all topics at school, whether it's science, language, history, have a good grasp of media literacy themselves. And yet nowadays we've got 5 million teachers working in Europe. Very few of them have ever had any training or any experience or any knowledge to build their skills in media literacy. And that is really a disgrace, particularly when you think of teacher training colleges nowadays still churning out new teachers going into schools, no media literacy training. So while I acknowledge that we have a role to play, I also have to say, please, we need help. We need policymakers taking this on board seriously. We need the platforms taking this on board seriously. We need to work with journalists, of course, and it's very important that we work with the media industry. But this is a problem that's facing us as a society on a far broader level than I think heretofore we have considered. And I'd like to leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Lots to consider there. Thanks. So next I wanted to turn to you, Peter, who, from Demagog's point of view, I think you look at these issues in a similar way to us at AFP in terms of being on the receiving end of this sometimes. So, we heard a lot this morning and in the second panel about what's been happening in the region with the elections recently, and obviously you've been across all of that. What are your perceptions of how these issues are playing out in these countries?
Yeah, thanks, Justin. I will just point out that I work for the Czech Demagog, so we publish in Czech. We also have our friends from the Slovak Demagog in here and the Polish Demagog. We're integrating them into the SEDMO consortium at this point, so really glad that they could join us here. As to what's happening in fact-checking, I would first like to maybe bring a little bit of context to how we perceive fact-checking, because obviously, when we think about AFP, that's a huge journalistic organization, but most fact-checking in Europe happens on the local level. We're talking about local fact-checkers, local initiatives. 4 years ago, the Czech Demagog, we couldn't even afford a single full-time employee, right? We were mostly a volunteer organization, and it was COVID that actually launched the fact-checking, the current initial fact-checking efforts, right? It attracted Meta to extend their partnership locally across Europe, and it attracted support from other platforms as well. And the Ukraine war has accelerated it even more, right? So we're just at the beginning of actually creating the existing fact-checking framework, and also in scaling fact-checking to actually be able to cover all of the types of content and the amount of content that's being spread online. So that's the context. As to what's happening in practice in those countries, I just want to talk briefly. So I prepared two examples that kind of show the limit of media literacy, limits of fact checking. Example number one, and both of them have to do with AI. So example number one, it's the elections that just happened in Slovakia, right? Days before the elections happened, a voice recording appeared of one of the major opposition parties, effectively planning election manipulation. It was the leader of the Progressive Party talking to a journalist, and they were supposed to be planning to manipulate the elections. It was an AI voice cloning recording, so it was faked, but it was entirely believable, and it would be very difficult for the ordinary person to be able to find anything wrong with that. You know, you could think of it, oh, it sounded a little bit off, but normal recordings sound a little bit off. People just don't talk like always naturally, right? So no level of media literacy will ever prepare the population for what's coming when it comes to deepfakes and then AI voice recordings and obviously generated texts as well. And that's where fact checking has to come in. It has to be much more scalable and it has to be much faster. I think you're going to talk about this as well, right? We're just way too slow. We have to be able to act as these things start to spread. And also the platforms has to have a much more proactive, and even if it impacts to some extent free speech, they have to be able to act on that kind of content before it reaches hundreds of thousands of people. Because when it happens during election, the retrospective fact checking is just pointless, right? We're not reaching the people as they are making their minds about critical decisions. And you know, those of you thinking about the European elections next year, those could be critical effects, right? The couple of percentage of people, the couple of percent of people that actually vote in those elections in the CEE will be motivated, and at least in part, by the infuriating and AI generated content that they see online. So that's where fact checking has to step in, has to be much more scalable. And then the second is the limits of fact checking itself. Also AI, we've recently been seeing a huge wave of AI generated scams. And it has to do with the fact that you can now generate a new website and new platforms at a rapid pace using autopilot, again, with the help of AI, of the new language models. And those things are perfect copies of news websites, perfect copies of existing trading websites. They attract people on social media. And the only thing that they're effectively asking you to do is just register your name and number and everything. They see all seems very legit until you actually register, and then you are targeted by people calling you up and ask and drag you into giving them your card information and that kind of thing. But the basic proposition there is they're offering people to make money out of the blue. Effectively, just you don't need to have any kind of initial investment, and you're going to be making money with us. That's the attraction. It's you're going to buy Bitcoin and suddenly you'll be making millions. And no level of fact checking will get beyond that basic lack of competence in financial literacy, effectively, or this is similar to the food literacy question, right? We're never going to be able to fact check every piece of content that people are going to come across. And some of the newer scams are just asking people to contact those scammers on Messenger. And I've seen videos of fact checkers trying to literally calling up people who are being targeted by scammers, trying to convince them to please not give your card information to that scammer. Please don't install this app. This is definitely going to steal your account contents and so on. They still do it. You just cannot convince these people. And this is even if we blanket the entire social media and cover 90% of people with targeted fact-checking labels, there'll still be people who absolutely need direct media literacy campaigns to them, because otherwise we're not going to be able to help them. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that's what you were saying was ringing lots of bells with sometimes feedback and fan mail that we occasionally get from our fact checks and, you know, the people that we try to target them towards, which I'll come back to later. But moving on to you, Philip, and picking up what Petra was saying about trying to make some of these efforts quicker, more scalable. So your organization, your NGO is trying to do that through the use of AI. Could you just explain a little bit about what that's about?
Yeah, absolutely. I would maybe prefix this all by saying that I'm not a journalist. I'm an AI person, kind of learning to also do a bit of journalism. And following up on that, as the last discussion was kind of depressing, I will be also slightly depressing here. Peter kind of covered some of the parts I wanted to say, and that is that currently we live in a world where right now, or maybe in a year or two, the text generation will be nigh impossible to detect. Thus, we can have essentially unlimited amount of text on the internet, published immediately, generated extremely quickly with high quality, and actually more persuasive than the text that journalists or anyone else would write, because there are studies showing that. And essentially, that is the limit in the scalability of fact-checking, because humans cannot scale to that measure. And currently developing a technology that would do fact extraction, there are many efforts on that, but currently they are very good, but they are definitely not perfect. And so what my organization, NGO, Verify.ai, is doing is that we are not focusing on fact-checking. We are not focusing on what are the facts in the article. We are focusing on credibility. Essentially, we look at how is the article written. We look at different sort of linguistic attributes of an article, like hate speech, logical fallacies, clickbait, and so on and so forth. And we essentially just analyze article through these linguistic attributes and sort of ascertain how credible or is the article, or like if it tries to deceive you, if there are any signs that the article tries to deceive you in some way. And I would say this is definitely not the entire solution. We need fact-checking. We need something that will say what is the truth. But fact-checking right now is not scalable enough. And so, yeah, we are kind of trying to distribute this more and like to also support these efforts with fact-checking also with different technology. I would also follow up on a topic that was mentioned previously, and that is that sort of media literacy is, in my opinion, extremely important because it's very hard to kind of persuade people who are already convinced about fake news and who are already convinced about some different version of reality, that their version of reality is sort of wrong. We can look at the Slovak elections right now, and we can look at that actual candidate proposed for a Minister of Environment. His main election point was that same-sex intercourse is causing climate change and global warming. I mean, I don't think we need fact-checking to prove that this is wrong. And yet still quite a few people believe that. And so there is this point that we need to catch people soon enough and quickly enough that they don't fall into this deep end. And I believe that technology plays a key role in this.
Thank you very much. Lots to come back to there as well, but still got to get through the first round. So to finish things off, Joyce, perhaps you can talk about some of the things that AFP is doing in this space and how they're approaching these questions of media literacy and fact-checking.
I think, as you know, AFP's focus is mainly on fact-checking, but we are also involved in some media literacy. In France, we do have some reporters, some who have even retired, who go out to schools and speak about fact-checking and some of the work we do. But we are also, our fact-checking team is becoming, they're finding that they need to be more and more proactive in terms of how we conduct our work as fact checkers, that it's not enough to just do fact checking. And we're doing more and more videos using a vertical format where we debunk some misinformation and include some media literacy in it. And some of these videos are going to be made available to all of the EDMO hubs if they so wish. And some of the SEDMO, we propose it to SEDMO, and we're going to probably be integrating them on the website. And I propose to show you one of the videos just to give an idea of how we're working now to try. I can't agree more with all the panelists here that we do need to go out and reach the younger, really reach them at a very young age. It's just a minute long, and it gives you an idea of the videos we're working on.
Did Iran fly a black flag for the first time in history to declare war on Israel? This image spread across social media in posts claiming it signaled the violence between Israel and Hamas would broaden to the entire Middle East. But while Iran did fly a black flag above a famous mausoleum, it was not a declaration of war. It was raised as a sign of mourning after a deadly strike on a hospital in Gaza. And it's far from being the first. The flag is flown each year on mosques and during processions during the month of Muharram, a period dedicated to the founding of Shia Islam, the predominant branch of Islam in Iran. The flag is also used to mark exceptional periods of mourning, in this case to pay homage to the Palestinian victims. Iranians have previously deployed a red flag to call for vengeance. It was flown, for example, in 2020 after a popular military commander was killed by a U.S. strike. But the gesture was not followed by military action.
So,
as
you see, we're using more video formats. If you want to learn more, for example, about this fact check, we do have a longer version, a written version. What else can I talk about? Some of these videos are going on Meta, on Instagram, on X, and hopefully on TikTok pretty soon. As far as AI, we're in speaking with our head of digital investigation. He told me that for now we're able to keep up with it, but for how long we don't know, because it's an ever-evolving technology. We saw recently 2 fact checks that really spread widely in France. One of them about Macron resigning. And if you looked at it, okay, Jastinder and I and most of you here would say, okay, it's fake. But you would be surprised at how widely shared that video was. It used his voice. You could see him speaking, and it looked very authentic. The same with a fact check on the Pope wearing the coat, the big coat, the white coat. It spread widely also. So we're able to keep up right now, but for how long? Because the technology is evolving so quickly, you have to keep up with it all the time. And I think we'll speak more widely as you open up the discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that, and for that example, for the several examples of what AFP is doing. I just wanted to come back first of all on a fairly specific point. This is perhaps just me being slightly nerdy, but Philip, with your project and with your use of AI, I mean, one of the criticisms and worries about trying to use AI in a more positive sense is that, you know, often with these models, they're kind of replicating the material that's been fed into them. So then they will also replicate the biases that are in there. For example, there's been lots of discussions about that. How do you approach that side of things? Like trying to make sure that the AI doesn't sort of go off piste, generate false positives, false negatives. How can we grapple with that challenge with the technology?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, AI is never perfect. It's literally never is. Even like our accuracy is about 90%, which on big scale still means that if we sort of assess 1,000 articles, 100 of them will be in some way wrong. Kind of post-processing is then about mitigating these kind of outliers. However, regarding the bias, I would say that the key point there is being transparent and kind of being aware about like how is your AI working, because obviously AI isn't just one single thing. It depends on you how you construct it. And so in our case, essentially what is happening that there is a specific model for each of the linguistic attributes. So for example, for clickbait, for hate speech, etc., etc. And so what we try to do is to use data sets kind of divorced from the Czech context. So using sort of multilingual data sets for hate speech and all for, let's say, clickbait and stuff like that. And essentially then apply them on Czech context and seeing that they work quite well. This kind of allows us to be very divorced from any bias towards specifically Czech topics. And then I would say the most important thing there is that the final model, which sort of assesses the credibility of an article, gives it a score from 0 to 100, a credibility score from 0 to 100, does not see anything except from this mathematical representation. We do not see the source. We do not see the writing style, like exact writing style. We do not see the name of the author. We only see this mathematical representation, which allows us to, for example, do the thing that in Czech we have this really big tabloid paper called Blesk, or Thunder, or Lightning in English, and they have sort of the tabloid section and they have the sort of journalistic section. And we are able to give the journalistic section scores of like 90 to 95. And we are able to then separate and give the tabloid sections scores from like 40 to 60, because they are much more sensational, much less truthful, much less honest. And this is all done because we do not observe a source. And yes, that's how we kind of avoid the pitfall of bias. I would also follow that up with the fact that we are trying to be as transparent as possible. And that allows us that if we do make the mistake, if you pay enough attention to our analysis and to what we show you, you are just able to see that, oh, they detected the wrong thing, because we give you exact examples of what we think is, for example, hate speech in that text. So if you then essentially doing a slight bit of media literacy there. So if you then go to these examples and see that the hate speech doesn't seem to be well annotated or doesn't seem to fit well with what we think, you are kind of able to see, oh, they made a mistake there. We usually don't, but if we do, you are able to see what we did wrong.
Okay. I mean, that mention of transparency is, reminds me of, it's something that most reputable journalistic organizations would also have as a very important value, something that certainly we do both on the newswire and in fact checks. When we need to correct something, we try to say it as openly as possible and explain to people. But nevertheless, I come back to, a lot of the discussions that we're having come back to this issue of trust and the lack of trust. And, despite all of those things, people, I suppose it depends how sort of deep people are into closed media ecosystems, but lots of people have lost trust, and it is, there's a lot of it feeds into the polarization that we're talking about. So what needs to happen? I mean, Sally, you mentioned other actors who need to get involved in terms of that broader rebuilding of trust across society that seems to be being eroded. I mean, talk about journalism, or during COVID-19, we saw it partially with medicine, and people trying to, increasingly doubting medical evidence and doctors. Which other stakeholders need to become active, and how?
That's such a big question. I'm absolutely terrified of answering. 'Cause I was just going to say, just in terms of trust, because sometimes one of the downsides of taking young people, for example, through the processes of understanding, pre-bunking, for example, understanding the tools and the mechanisms that are used, means that the end result is, in fact, that young people don't trust any media. So there's also a downside there in terms of trust when you introduce teachers, for example, in Flanders, don't want to use those kinds of approaches in their classes because they feel at the end of the day, everybody leaves the class and says, okay, so I can't trust anybody. So trust is, I find that an impossible question to answer, I'm afraid, simply because I think we're talking about something that's broadly societal, and we're talking about building trust in our institutions, in our systems, in our democratic processes, which is a huge job.
And it's, as you were saying before, journalism, fact-checking, media literacy campaigns can only go so far,
Absolutely.
but it needs to be supported.
That's one of the things I think we sometimes get asked, kind of what initiatives work and what's a good way of doing it. For me, it's not an either or, it's not saying, well, we're doing that one thing with our young people or with our older people or whoever. It's and. It's all of these things. It's the video clips that are short pills, if you like, that we promote across our media. We're talking about good media literacy in schools, but also opportunities in youth clubs and organizations where young people get together, but also right the way across society. So it's a big job, without sounding facetious. Jochens, going to answer.
Yeah, just adding something to that. When I was working in journalism, it was always there was a saying, you get it right 1,000 times and nothing really happens. Everybody expects it, so that's normal. But you get it wrong once and everybody jumps at you, is ready to kill you. And yes, as I said earlier, sometimes people get it wrong because we're human beings, and there's also divergent views on certain topics. But that's, again, why I think it's so fundamentally important to tell people, young people, but also older people, how journalism works. And that people, like human beings, make mistakes. We have to be open and transparent about it, but mistakes do happen. But if we explain that at least and raise some awareness, then I think that's one way of showing people, young people, but also older people, that at least those who are committed to quality journalism are aiming high. They don't always get it, they don't always achieve it, and they make mistakes, and there's also different sides, or there's often different angles to a particular story, but explaining that and doing so in an open and constructive way. I mean, I don't know if you followed the discussion in the UK recently, and when was it, last week or so before, when it really reached very, very high waves, how to call Hamas, and the BBC refused or did not call Hamas a terrorist organization. So a number of people, John Simpson was one of them, I don't know if you know John Simpson, he's a reporter, war reporter of 40 years, so he tried to explain in a sort of constructive way. And yes, there are certain reasons why you could call them a terrorist organization, or maybe not, but just remaining or staying in a sort of constructive debate is at least something we should aim for and strive for.
Thank you. And yeah, that very same debate has also been playing out in France, well, in many different countries, I imagine. Joyce, just turning to you, I mean, I know, in terms of us at AFP, we also come up against the limits of this kind of work in terms of, looking at certain actors who are being held accountable in this space. What are do you have any thoughts on kind of what's needed more broadly to make a more healthy information ecosystem?
Well, one of the things that, in speaking with our fact checkers, one of the things they're doing now is in terms of being more proactive, is they're addressing the disinformation pandemic that we have everywhere, is that they're going after some of the actors in terms of name and shame. Use formats that they're using, which is video formats, speaking in front of the camera, shorter formats. We do realize that some of while it's important to write fact checks that are in-depth, especially if you're talking about issues like COVID, you need to bring about scientific information. But we are aware also that readers are not always going to sit down and read a 1,000 or 2,000 word fact check. It's just not going to happen. So we are looking, I mean, that's why we're looking at these shorter formats to be just, you know, nail it down from the start, be more proactive, reaching younger people. Because I sit there every day and I read all of the fact checks. And in all honesty, I work on 4 of the Edmo hubs. And in all honesty, I don't see how many of our readers are going to sit down and read through all of our fact checks. It's just, I think maybe the researchers use our work, and I think they like it. But if you think somebody out there in the public is going to take one of these fact checks and read 2,000 words, I think, I'll be honest, I don't think they're going to do it. That's why they're turning into shorter formats, videos, reaching people at a younger age, and older people. We recently did an in-depth fact check for the de facto website, where we looked at you know, who are the biggest purveyors of disinformation. And it's not younger people, they found. It's not younger people who are hitting it's more older people who are maybe not very tech savvy, not very media savvy. We were speaking to a group of university students the other day, and they said it's their parents. It's not them. It's their parents, where they go home and they talk to their parents and they say, "Mom, don't hit the send button. It's, you know, this picture is not true." So I think we need to develop critical thinking, like Sally said, in schools, teach the teachers. Many of the teachers that we go and that, you know, we encounter themselves are not trained in detecting this information. We need to teach the teachers. We need to get to much, much younger audiences and older audiences. I hope I've addressed.
No, absolutely. I mean, the point about the formats is something that we do, you know, struggle with all the time. And like you were mentioning, it's, I suppose it's about providing a variety of, as with the example with that video, there's as you were saying, there's a longer version where one of our colleagues went away and spoke to 3 experts on Iran who explained exactly what this shrine was and the previous instances where this flag has been used and what is the Iranian policy in terms of the conflict, the current conflict. I suppose we always have to, our feeling is, you know, in some form or other, we have to have that available for perhaps the minority of people who do want to go away and find out about things in more depth, and then for those who just want a quick, you know, tell me what the deal is here. We try to cater to that as well.
I just looked at just one more thing. If you look at when I spoke to a lot of my friends, I would ask them, where do your kids get their information? Many of them would point in France to a guy called Hugo, and his website is called Hugo Decrypte. I just looked, he's got 3 million followers. And what Hugo does is short videos. Somebody's shaking their head to know what I'm talking about. Short videos, he addresses an issue, and in 30 seconds, he talks about it, and boom. That's where a lot of the young people are getting their info. The guy has 3 million followers.
I mean, that's, you know, with social media in general, particularly kind of influencers, people who aren't from a traditional journalistic background, I think their style, that form of kind of very immediate, very human connection is something that in some sense it's very difficult. Absolutely. It's very easy to identify with that person. It's something that for a traditional media organization is, you know, a little bit more difficult, where we have to be more considered in what we say. And not that Natalie wasn't very engaging and great. I think she did a great job. Anyway, sorry.
It is a great idea. It's just not an alternative to fact-checking, right? The way we've been treating this is we always put out a fact-checking article, and then we have a tiny one paragraph, kind of the gist of it. And the benefit of that is it's enough for people to understand it if they want to share it, but it's also the existence of the long-form fact-checking article is intimidating enough to people who want to criticize it, who people who want to simply ignore it, that they will not actually engage with it. They will not post a dismissive comment. But if you just put out the short TikTok, it's always easy to point holes into it, and so it needs to be both at the same time.
Absolutely, yeah, that complementary approach.
Round, or maybe also to the others. So what you were just saying, Joyce, so what does it mean for us as established old organizations? Do we all have to become Hugos? Or do we have to try and get the Hugos to talk in a different way? Or what?
No, I don't think we need to all be Hugos, but I think we need to adapt to this changing, and if we want to reach that audience, we need to change maybe the way we do things. I don't know if you've seen some of his videos. They're pretty good, very snappy. You've seen them, I think.
I feel like I'm in the target audience. I do not watch him, but I know about him. But
yeah,
when I'm speaking, I will maybe follow up on this. I feel like there is kind of the responsibility to do both, because it's very, like, I've seen many established institutions, and I don't mean AFP or Deutsche Welle, but like different established institutions sometimes complaining about like young people not reading long articles. But I would also say that like many old people don't read long articles. I would kind of say that it's even more dangerous that like when we kind of grew up on this culture of quick snappy information sharing, it's kind of easy for us to filter something out. But if you joined Facebook in your 60s and suddenly you came into contact with this quick, snappy, funny style of, let's call it journalism, you might not have sort of the antibodies and sort of the ability in yourself to like filter this content, and it might be even much more dangerous to you than it would be to like a, I don't know, 20-year-old person.
So true, yeah. I think younger generations often get a bit of a bad rep during these discussions. So it's good. It's good that you and Joyce were kind of giving us that corrective. I'm just aware that time is ticking on, and I wanted to leave space for any questions from the audience. If anybody had any, I think we have one there. Yeah. Sorry.
We don't have to offer the.
He's doing it for free, so I think we can go ahead. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Wojtek Svatek, Prague University of Economics and Business. What you mentioned at the end was quite interesting for me, because we are running an international project called Simple, with C at the beginning. You may have heard of it. It's coordinated by people from Eurocom France, who collaborate also with AFP Media Lab, so you can press that. But actually, there are different partners, and a part of this research in this European project is about using memes and poems for explaining misinformation. And we are all the time arguing with our colleagues whether it's good or bad, because in one sense, as you just mentioned, this is attractive for young people. But on the other hand, memes, and especially memes, have quite a bit of emotional load, and it can also contribute to the polarization of the society with respect to the topic. So that I will be quite interested in your opinions. And a second, more general common question. You've talked about summarization in the form of text. So what was particularly interesting for me is we have seen some nice infographics in the welcome session. So whether infographics, possibly created through AI, could also be a solution, which is, say, less conflicting than videos or memes in some sense. Thanks.
Thank you. I mean, yeah, just to the second point, we always try to, think about how we can incorporate any kind of more visual, more engaging, more kind of immediately recognizable content. The issue is just sometimes that, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, we were pretty much doing, wall-to-wall COVID, and it's not like that anymore, but we still get a steady stream of claims about COVID, and stories like that often are much more difficult to represent in any kind of visual way because the claims aren't being made in a visual way, and the explanation has to be sort of quite scientific and a little heavy. But I don't know if anybody else had any thoughts about any of those ideas. Very interesting ideas. Sound very attractive.
I think that especially for when we mentioned COVID, right? So there were claims about the structure of the vaccine and what they do with the body. So if you can visualize the kind of, what it looks like when the vaccine works, if you can visualize the development of the infected population, effectively, how it can quickly go from the low numbers that you're seeing that. But I think the point is even if it's, I guess it's just text, right? But it's presented in the form of a nice flashy graphics, such as word graphics. Would it be more palatable to the online audience? I think maybe, yeah.
I think I agree. I think it would be. And I think what Peter said in terms of the format where more of us are using now is start the fact check with a summary, basically. Just like 2-3 paragraphs, so that if somebody doesn't want to read the whole thing, at least they know that a picture they see that they thought was true is fake. It dates back to 2019 or something like that. And then if they want to read more, then they can read the whole fact check. But I think it's good, like Peter was saying, to have the paragraph at the beginning.
Just good to say, I think it's also a perfect opportunity to do a bit of testing, try out with and without and see what the reaction is. You've got a very easy situation there to control, so you could test it out. I would strongly suggest doing that. Yeah, make sure that there's a testing phase, yeah.
But I agree that visual is...
I mean, just to indulge in a moment of self-criticism of, being representative of a big media organization. And before working for AFP, I was also with the BBC, and there were also, many discussions there, as you can imagine, about how to try to compete with people doing more innovative things. I suppose, for big organizations, there's always going to be an element of playing catch up a little bit when you're talking about, people who are, like I said, influencers, or who part of a very, very small team, or just working alone. I don't know if this Hugo Decrypt guy has a whole team, or if it sounds like it's just him.
Yeah, it's basically him.
He can wake up in the morning and do whatever he wants, but he's great. Yeah. Sounds good. But within a bigger organization, often, there are sort of processes to go through. And so I suppose for us, it's about thinking how we can streamline those a bit more and be more reactive with the innovation.
I think you have to think of in organizations like AFP, like the BBC, like Reuters, like AP, all of the major news organizations. Our job before was basically reporting the news. Today, in a way, we have to prove that what we're reporting is true. Before you went out as a reporter, you covered an event, you wrote about it. Today, you almost have to back up what you wrote to prove it's true, which is new to all of us.
Yeah, and it's a skill that people have, it's something that people have to now kind of remember, to bear in mind. It's like our colleague, Danny Kemp, who was one of the first journalists, I believe, into Bucha in Ukraine after it was retaken by Ukrainian forces, and sort of said immediately as he went in that he knew that this event was going to be a big source of disinformation. So that, he was then documenting. I mean, a lot of that you would do anyway as a reporter, like documenting what you're seeing, but he was doing it with the specific, intention of being able to then help us in fact-checking, which, is unfortunate, but it's something that I guess we have to learn more and more how to do.
And if I may add to that, but what's also changed is that in situations like Ukraine, currently Gaza, Israel, especially in Gaza at the moment, there's very few journalists on the ground. There's a few local Palestinian journalists in Gaza, but I don't know of any. No, there is nobody. So what everybody's relying on is footage coming from there. So that requires new and additional skills. And we've seen that with the incident of the hospital bombing, that was very quickly, certain sides were being blamed, and then it took quite a lot of time to really discover or try and find out who fired, what it was, where the missile came from, and so on and so forth. So using forensic techniques, using military expertise, and what have you. So this is also for journalism, this is requiring new skills. And when you have the news cycle that some of us are involved in, where sort of everybody always wants to be fast or the first, can we still afford, again, another learning of my old days, get it first, but first get it right. But not everybody plays along to that. For some people, it's just like more important to get it first in order to have the scoop, and then they don't care too much whether it's right or wrong, as long as they get the eyeballs or the impressions or whatever. So this is also like a bigger problem in terms of the media systems we operate in.
I think what we're working up against is, just as with news, the first image you see, the first, even if it's wrong, sometimes that's what stays with you. And then you have to work so much harder to switch somebody's opinion, because that's what stays in people's minds, that first image, even if it's the wrong image, and then you show them that it's fake, that it's not true.
The image and the way it is interpreted
Yes.
or communicated.
Yeah, it stays with you.
I think we've got time for one or two more questions, if there are any from the floor.
A technical question, because I'm from Czech Technical University. My question goes to Philip. You mentioned that your accuracy is about 90% on detection. Can you say something about the test set? What is the test set, and how do you train your system? Because I can imagine that the data set can be very imbalanced, because you have like real articles from like credible media, and where do you take data from the fake articles?
Yes. So I wasn't expecting this to be technical. I would have prepared more sources for me. But yeah, so how we did it is essentially the question there. I would say, being on these premises, it's important to highlight the role of Charles University in this whole research, because they essentially helped us to compile a data set, a balanced data set of more than 10,000 Czech articles annotated by journalism students and annotated with a special tags of like what is wrong in each specific article. But I would also say that this testing was also done in wild, essentially after the model was trained, and because there was some gap between what articles, like time-wise, what articles and on what topics have we been able to annotate versus the articles that are currently published. Because, for example, when we were annotating, I think in the first round of annotations, the war in Ukraine did not happen yet. So you can imagine that the news and the news diet looked quite differently there. And so we then also tested it in wild, essentially in small team, going through current Czech news and testing the accuracy. Also, to answer the disbalance there, obviously there are much more credible news. Even though it might not seem like that, there are so much more credible news than sort of the fake news. The issue is that they do not spread so fast. There is a lot of research showing that fake news spread on average 6 times faster than credible news. So what we did in terms of balance is we essentially pre-identified what websites would be likely to publish fake news, or would be more likely to publish credible news or tabloid news and stuff like that. And then we went through X amount of articles per site, also classified them on our own, and then also looked at them through Verify and tested that the accuracy fit, or not the result fitted, and sort of ascertained the accuracy from it. We also published a paper about our entire process. It's called, I think, checking fake news articles. So you can absolutely find it there. But yeah, essentially, the point there was to make it balanced, because obviously the disbalance would introduce bias, which we already discussed. I also, when I'm speaking, I also wanted to react on the previous topic and kind of return to the memes there. And that was that I also think that the current conflict in Israel or in Gaza shows us also how easy it is to attack on social media, so the credible established institutions. I like when I'm in Britain, literally every YouTube video I watched is sort of prefixed by a video either from supporters of Palestine or supporters of Israel, and both of these videos are very aggressive about the one or the other side. They quite often describe themselves as like charitable, like support this side or support that, but usually are quite aggressive, and the social medias kind of reflect that. For example, I think BBC changed the title of the article regarding the bombing or the bombing of the hospital. They've changed the article about the title of the article like 3 times, and somebody just took screenshots of it and made like a meme format, like imagine being established institution and then just putting the three different sort of titles there and showing that BBC is not, like sort of implying that BBC is not credible, even though it was very much a human thing to sort of change it. And so I feel like this war with how sort of emotionally charged it is, even in the Western world, much more than the war in Ukraine, which like the Western world has quite a good idea on which side it stands. I would say it's used very much as an attack on established media, or can be used to attack the established media.
Yeah, the role of emotion in lots of these discussions was something that I did have in the back of my mind to come to, but I fear we might be running out of time. Unless there were any other burning comments or questions that anybody had. Oh, there's one more. Okay.
Hi, my name is Gracia Somariva, and I am from the Kosciuszko Institute, a think tank in Poland. I have a question about pre-banking, and I was wondering how do your organizations prepare for those events that are going to be full of misinformations and disinformation. So, for example, the elections, the EU elections coming. There is going to be disinformation. There are going to be influence campaigns from multiple sides. So I just was wondering, how are you preparing, or how do you prepare, if you have got plans, when it's the moment to start addressing these issues? Thank you.
Wow, I mean, just speaking from personal experience, in any kind of journalistic organization, there is always an element of planning, of course, but most of the time it feels like I was saying, we are quite reactive. Nobody saw coming what happened on the 7th of October in terms of Gaza and Israel. Very few people, although we had a bit more warning, I suppose, with the invasion of Ukraine, or you could take the COVID-19 pandemic. Often it's these things which are very unexpected, which then end up taking up a lot of time, a lot of energy and resource. And even for, things which we can see coming in terms of the elections, it's easier to do from a traditional journalistic standpoint because, there's certain events that, you have to cover and certain people that, you have to follow. In terms of disinformation, and Petra mentioned the example of the video, the phone call with the leader of the opposition in Slovakia. We were aware of the sorts of things that people were saying and the sorts of accusations that they were making about him, but that was something out of left field. So again, we're kind of reacting. I don't know if anybody has anything more helpful to say. Sorry, I feel like I'm not answering your question.
I think We don't have a dedicated team that's going to be working on the EU elections, but we sort of know where this is going to go. We know they're going to target candidates. We know climate is probably going to be an issue. We know immigration is going to be an issue. So you sort of keep your antennas up and you know that these subjects are going to come up. But in a way that fact-checking follows the news cycle. We know that just with any major event, the earthquakes in Morocco or in Turkey, the death of the Queen, we know that's going to generate a lot of disinformation. So you do keep your antennas up and you keep an eye out. And we know that for the EU elections, the sort of issues that are going to be probably up there is immigration, climate, probably what's happening now with Israel, Hamas, those kind of issues.
Just to say that on behalf of the EDMO EU hubs, the hubs that are working with the media literacy part, over half of them have plans in place to have media literacy campaigns directly aimed at the topics that will come up in the elections. We have a first piece of material which is coming in fact from a VRT broadcaster in Flanders, which is it's working with the EDMO hub in Belgium on politics which can be used. So everybody very anxious, everybody looking at sharing resources and finding ways that we can actually focus in on not just the fake news that's going to appear, the disinformation that's going to appear, but on what this impact has in terms of democratic choice and how politics works and putting it in that sector, propaganda and what its position is. So getting ready, I think is probably the best way, looking at resources, sharing materials, very aware of the fact that it's going to be a big challenge for all of us in 24.
And I should just mention as well that, for a lot of these topics, whether it's climate change or several of these, we often see similar claims that recur. So, we're prepared in that sense a lot of the time, in the sense that we've seen these claims already, so that we can react to them more quickly. But yeah, fundamentally, I would say from our point of view, it is fairly reactive. Did anybody? Did you?
No, in terms of pre-bunking, I think 3 ways to kind of go about it. So one is the approach of the media literacy, right? Pointing out the manipulative methods that people can use. Similar approach was taken by Google Jigsaw, right? They point out those kind of manipulative narratives. It's very broad and general, and it's more of a media literacy. It has to reach an audience that's open to this, right? They have to be able to accept that they can be manipulated in those particular ways. But that works in some extent. Then the second thing is pointing out the actors and the methods that like making sure that just before the elections, we put out articles describing the kind of misinformation that comes out about the election manipulation, for instance. Pointing out that, just before the last, after the last elections, we have these and these people who are talking about media election manipulation, because they're going to come up with this again, right? And we should put out the fact check or the pre-bunk out there before they get it. But that's largely the responsibility of journalistic organizations, of all kinds of, not just fact checkers, right? We should be talking about the fact that some of the losing parties are going to point out, are going to, make up stories about election manipulation, right? And they're going to put out fake audios, that kind of things. And then the last thing is, pre-bunk, as in we found out that there's a piece of content spreading online, and we need to make sure that the person who sees that piece of content sees it already with the fact check. But that's not really our responsibility to the fullest. It's a responsibility of the platforms to employ tools that are able to deploy fact checks as quickly as possible, right? I mean, this is Meta's responsibility to a large extent. We cannot just sit back and have Meta, pretend that they're just a platform, they're just spreading, they're not journalists, they're not, a media organization, and then just spread falsehoods out there, even though there already is fact checks that's debunking it, right? But that's what they're doing right now. That's the role of the platforms that they need to pick up as well.
I mean, Meta, sorry, did you? Did you want
If I can add to that, I mean, elections, the European elections or any elections, they're so-called scheduled or planned events. So we know when they take place, and then we can prepare for it. We can research, we can provide material or collect material beforehand and all that. And if you're interested, Edmo Central, so is also put together a task force on the European election, again, to be prepared and to be ready if anything comes up. Because what we don't know is what type of disinformation will be out there, but it's likely that there will be some. It's more tricky when there's unplanned or unscheduled events like the current one in the Middle East. But then for that, it's important to have policies in place, to have workflows in place, to have emergency plans in place, to have staff who can handle such situations. And I'm surprised, I don't know if it has been mentioned, but I mention it here, what all this requires is money. This requires money, because some of that work that is put into preparing for something to happen may not even be used. So you may just have a journalist or a team of journalists working on something who prepare on eventualities that never take place. So then if you just purely run it by economic paradigms, well, what was your output? There was no output. But that, again, and I've said that earlier, requires addressing and answering the question, what are we prepared for our media systems in our nation states or in Europe to prosper and to provide those services? And I know I'm very biased because I work for a public service media organization, but are we prepared to fund media systems that include public service and commercial that compete or that act also on qualitative terms and not purely on commercial terms or not on ideological terms, whatever. That's also something we, I think, need to address and answer.
Absolutely. And I mean, that's, I was berating AFP perhaps a little bit earlier on for being too slow, but in certain other respects, that's where a big legacy media organization comes into its own in moments such as that, because, we have this huge resource and network that we can tap into. We have people who speak Arabic, who speak Hebrew, Farsi, who know the nuances and complexities of these issues. So, yeah, that's one area where it helps to be perhaps an organization that's a little older, more traditional. But you need money, absolutely. No, that's the key point. Now, I am aware, we've run over a fair bit, and so apologies. I think we should wrap it up, even though I think we could keep going for quite some time. So I think it just remains for me to say thank you very much to all of the panelists for all of your contributions. And I think I'm handing over to Nick to say some closing words for the day.
Does it work now? Perfect. So I was, unlike Václav, who was kicking this off, I was asked to say a few words to wrap it up before, obviously I have also great news in relation to the dinner and everything that we're all excited about. But I heard people comparing and contrasting CEDMO at 2 conference with the last year, and obviously the one that we had last year was much bigger, to the extent that we informally called it a jamboree. This one, I think, that was much more focused, and I think that the 3 panels, the way we wanted to design it, basically covered most of the things that are really pressing. I'm thinking about a metaphor that could interlink all 3, not only in the concept paper, which we set in a deliberately provocative manner. So that was the gloomy vision, and I recommend to all of you to read the Nightfall novelette by Isaac Asimov. It may be not his most well-known, because there is obviously iRobot, but I think that this metaphor with 6 shining suns and then the rest, as you can read it in the concept paper, I think that that's a good metaphor also for the EU. Personally, I'm quite satisfied, I need to say, with what we heard and the topics that we covered, given that this is a single-day conference coming back to the metaphor, I think that we're living in a period where the thickening of time, as some sociologists have called it, is really what we're dealing with. You have domestic populism on the rise, although in the first panel we heard, and that's important, especially for those of you who are coming from the outside of the region, that there are many trends and nuances that define the broad and possibly dangerous oversimplifications and generalizations. I think that we're also dealing with a period in which, and this has been interesting for me, Israel and Hamas got mentioned more frequently than Ukraine. For those of you who were here the last year, you know that Ukraine was very big and for obvious reasons. And the domestic populism combines with international revisionism. I think that what we're dealing with here is international revisionism, not only by the Russians, but these days, obviously, the situation in and around the Gaza Strip, which obviously these days is not about the Gaza Strip, but has echoes around the world. One of the things that I can see clearly is that the rest of the world, we say the rest, which is very patronizing because it's the majority of the world, is not buying necessarily into the European narratives. I think that this is a lesson that we need to be learning. It's much easier to be seeing that the pro-Ukrainian position has been established in Europe, and then obviously we're being told about the third world and how differently the Russians been working with, you know, a considerable degree of success. But here we're having the Israeli-Palestinian or the Israeli-Hamas conflict, which obviously transforms the ways in which established liberal democracies are working in Europe. Consider the situation going from this country being the most pro-Israeli country in the whole of the European Union, then you see obviously what's going on in places such as Germany, France, and the UK, including the BBC debate on whether they are, meaning Hamas, whether they are, and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing to be labeling them as terrorists, or how you want to talk to them. So I think that that's another one. Contributing to that still, this thickening of time, is obviously the technological transformation. And we're not talking about anything that we would be able to witness in a couple of decades. We're talking about the major transformation. And I was very happy also to have here the discussion of the isotype, because that was the last period when transformation of such a magnitude could be recorded and could be observed, going from the Industrial Revolution and then towards the first half of, or the first 30 years of the 20th century. I think that the panel on AI and generative AI and big language models and the regulation, having also the regulator's perspective here through Christina, but also the Vice President of the European Commission herself, put things into perspective. And I thought that this is an incredibly important debate that we had. We're talking about super exponential technologies. I'm not talking about anything smaller than that. Think about that. You know, it's not like the ascent of the internet. It's not just the individual technologies that we have, but also the combination. So we're talking about, and what Johan tried to conclude with very successfully, with the money aspect, the platformized world, where you have obviously the high risk, high gain technologies that combine 2, 3, 4, 5 of them to produce something that we haven't seen from the 19th century, I would be arguing. And that is still the thickening of time. And obviously, we don't have the benefit of working through this precautionary principle in the same manner that, you know, it may be from genetically modified regulation, etc. That is to say, so why don't we pause and see whether the technology is safe enough for us to embrace it in the end? Hence, you have these, you know, calls by people such as Elon Musk and the Silicon Valley tech types arguing for the freeze, the stop of training models. Here I'm skeptical. I don't think that that's the way forward, not for the reasons that you may want to think, but I think that Luciano Floridi was absolutely right when he talked about the EU in a context, and he mentioned the UK. He started with UK saying it's going wrong, and then he spoke about the G7, inconclusive. Obviously, we know that this is the problem of collective action. In the US, you don't have that, but it's top-down and possibly something that is not going to withstand the pressure of the next president and possibly Republicans getting into power, etc. And then he said, in this context, that the EU is quite healthy and well because it understands the priorities. And I thought that that was a really good point to put it into perspective, because obviously we're dealing with many of the inconsistencies and we're dealing with many issues that we don't like. We see someone mentioned, I think that there was just in there talking about the big institution compared to a small, nimble institution. We're at Charles University, you know, with CEDMO. We know what this is about and how long processes that takes. But they're worthwhile sometimes fighting for, and they're more permanent and durable. Although there's always some guy like, was it Igo, or who has 3 million followers today, but God knows what he's going to do tomorrow. So I thought that that was really important to see the innovation and how that works in the regulated framework that we have, still with a metaphor of thickening of time. And I think that this is really what we have. So the reason why I'm skeptical of the freeze myself is because if you realize that, and even the G7, the unsuccessful discussion there, you're getting the fault lines that we know. And these are political fault lines. So the technology is going to be regulated along the fault lines that we've seen before. Think about the advantage that the Chinese would get. Think about the advantage that many of authoritarian states would have with training their language models while the Western countries are going to ponder all of the issues. And again, I think that we're with political principles, which also ties it to the EU elections. My understanding is that much of the stuff that and I'm very happy about this particular panel to be able to bridge media literacy and fact-checking. We had a long debate on this, whether to separate it or whether to put it together. And we arrived at a conclusion that we need to put it together for reasons that you guys told us about, and I was very happy to hear about. And obviously this is the trend, and we understand that this is the living lab. Yes, the pre-bunking, yeah, that has great benefits. Can it be dangerous? For sure. Just the sheer politicization, the fact that you're entering into the political debate as an actor who tries to pre-bunk, I mean, that's not innocent thing. Should we try? For sure, we need to. But there's a big unknown unknowns that are being obviously taken from this. So I think that these are the few issues. CEDMO at 2, CEDMO starting the 3rd year. We're now with the research and what CEDMO does as obviously we have some partners here, but also we have the general audience. So the vision for CEDMO in relation to all of this is we're expanding. We're trying to bring along new partners in a democratic manner. We're trying to do our best to make sure that each of the 3 countries which compose the hub are going to be representatively, in a non-statistical manner, involved in what we're doing. We're also bringing together things like media literacy and fact-checking without resigning to the classical missions. We're involving the young generation, the digit 25 below generation, which is the key generation here. So we're also experimenting. And obviously some of the lessons that we're taking may be wrong. We don't know, because we're learning by doing. And that's all from me for today. And I would like to thank you for your participation, both to the panelists for this panel, for all 3 panels, and also to the audience, also giving great questions. questions. And that is my absolute pleasure to invite all of you for the dinner. I told you that I'm going to be back with a dinner. So the dinner is going to begin at 6 o'clock, and that's not the only good news. The other one is that you know where, because it's going to be in the same place as the lunch was taking place. So many thanks, and great, and stay with us. Thank you.